The carriage wheels clattered against cobblestones as Mirelle pressed her face to the window, watching the imposing towers of Ravencrest Palace emerge from the morning mist. Her fingers traced nervous patterns on the velvet seat cushion while her stomach churned with equal parts anticipation and dread. The marriage contract in her father's study had been signed months ago, binding her to Prince Aldric of Valenhall in an arrangement that would secure her family's dwindling fortune and strengthen political alliances between their kingdoms. She had never met her intended husband, knew nothing of his character beyond the formal portraits that depicted a stern young man with piercing blue eyes, and an expression that suggested he found the world perpetually disappointing. The palace gates swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through her bones, and Mirelle pulled her traveling cloak tighter around her shoulders. The Gothic architecture loomed overhead, all sharp angles and brooding gargoyles that seemed to watch her approach with stone-carved malevolence. Servants in burgundy livery rushed forward to attend to her luggage, their movements efficient but their faces carefully neutral. She had expected some measure of ceremony for her arrival, perhaps a formal greeting from the royal household, but the courtyard felt strangely empty despite the bustle of activity around her carriage. "Lady Mirelle," a voice called out, and she turned to see a tall woman in midnight blue silk approaching with measured steps. The woman's graying hair was pulled back in an elaborate chignon, and her pale green eyes held a calculating intelligence that made Mirelle feel suddenly scrutinized. "I am Lady Evangeline Ashford, the Queen's Chamberlain. Her Majesty regrets that she cannot greet you personally, as she is indisposed with a headache, but she has instructed me to see to your comfort and orientation." Mirelle curtsied deeply, her years of etiquette training taking over despite her nervousness. "Thank you, Lady Ashford. I am honored to be welcomed into the royal household." Her voice came out smaller than she had intended, barely above a whisper, and she cleared her throat delicately. Lady Ashford's expression softened slightly, though her smile remained polite rather than warm. "You must be exhausted from your journey. I will show you to your chambers so you may rest and refresh yourself before dinner. Prince Aldric is away on diplomatic business in the northern provinces, but he is expected to return within the fortnight." She paused, studying Mirelle's face with those keen eyes. "I trust you will find the palace to your liking, though I should warn you that it is an old building with many peculiarities. The servants sometimes speak of strange occurrences, but I assure you these are merely the product of overactive imaginations and too much time spent in shadowy corridors." The warning sent a chill down Mirelle's spine, though she nodded politely and followed Lady Ashford through the massive oak doors into the palace proper. The entrance hall was magnificent and intimidating in equal measure. With soaring ceilings painted in rich blues and golds, and tapestries depicting ancient battles and mythical creatures, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the marble floors, and Mirelle's footsteps echoed despite her efforts to walk quietly. She noticed how the servants they passed avoided making eye contact, hurrying about their duties with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the mundane tasks they were performing. Her chambers were located in the east wing, Lady Ashford explained as they climbed a sweeping staircase adorned with portraits of long-dead royalty. The paintings seemed to follow their progress with painted eyes, and Mirelle found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, though she could not say what she expected to see. The corridors were lined with tall windows that should have filled the spaces with natural light, but heavy curtains in deep crimson blocked most of the sun's rays, leaving everything bathed in a perpetual twilight that made even the most benign architectural details appear ominous. "These will be your quarters until the wedding," Lady Ashford said, opening a door carved with intricate rose motifs. "Your lady's maid will be Rosalind, a girl from the village who has served the palace for several years. She is discreet and competent, though perhaps a bit prone to flights of fancy. I trust you will find everything to your satisfaction." The rooms were indeed luxurious, with a sitting area furnished in rose silk and cream brocade, a bedroom dominated by a massive four-poster bed hung with embroidered curtains, and a private bathing chamber with a marble tub that could easily accommodate 2 people. French doors opened onto a small balcony that overlooked the palace gardens, where autumn flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds despite the advancing season. Mirelle moved to the window, grateful for the natural light and the view of something alive and growing in this place that felt so dominated by stone and shadow. "Dinner is served at 8 o'clock, Lady Ashford continued, setting down a small silver bell on the writing desk. "Ring if you require anything before then. Rosalind will come at 7 to help you dress appropriately." She paused at the door, her hand resting on the ornate handle. "A word of advice, my dear. The palace has been home to the royal family for over 3 centuries, and old buildings often make strange sounds, especially at night. The wind in the corridors can sound almost like voices, and the settling of ancient timbers can create the most peculiar noises. I mention this only so you will not be unduly alarmed if you hear anything unusual." After Lady Ashford departed, Mirelle sank into one of the soap-upholstered chairs and allowed herself a moment to process the magnitude of her situation. She was truly here, in this imposing palace, preparing to marry a man she had never met and join a family she knew only through formal correspondence and court gossip. The weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, and she found herself longing for the familiar comfort of her father's modest estate, where she had spent her days reading in the library or tending to her small garden of herbs and wildflowers. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding, and a young woman with curly auburn hair and bright hazel eyes entered with a cheerful smile that seemed almost foreign in the palace's somber atmosphere. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but I'm Rosalind, and I've come to see if you need anything unpacked or if you'd like a bath drawn before dinner." Her accent carried the lilting tones of the local countryside, and her manner was refreshingly direct after Lady Ashford's careful formality. "That would be wonderful, thank you," Mirelle replied, grateful for the girl's warm demeanor. "And please, when we are alone, just call me Mirelle. I fear I will need all the friends I can find in this place." Rosalind's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced toward the door as if checking to ensure they were not overheard. "You're very kind, Lady Mirelle. I hope you don't mind my saying, but you seem different from what I expected. The last lady who was engaged to Prince Aldric was rather demanding." "The last lady?" Mirelle's curiosity was immediately piqued. "I was not aware there had been a previous engagement." "Oh, it was years ago, when the prince was barely 18, Rosalind said, busying herself with unpacking Mirelle's gowns and hanging them in the massive wardrobe. Lady Cordelia Blackthorn, she was called. Beautiful as a painting and twice as cold, according to the staff who remember her. She only stayed at the palace for a few weeks before the engagement was called off rather suddenly. Some say she couldn't bear the thought of marrying Prince Aldric, though others whisper it was something else entirely that drove her away." "What sort of something else?" Mirelle asked, though she was not entirely certain she wanted to know the answer. Rosalind's hand stilled on the emerald silk gown she was holding, and she looked around the room with an expression that seemed almost fearful. "Well, you'll think me foolish, but there are stories about the palace. Old stories that the servants pass down, though Lady Ashford doesn't like us speaking of such things. They say there's a presence here, a spirit that has walked these halls for longer than anyone can remember. Most of the time he keeps to himself, but sometimes—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I shouldn't be filling your head with such nonsense on your first day." "Please," Mirelle said gently, moving closer to the girl. "I would rather know what people believe, even if it is only superstition. What do they say about this spirit?" "They say he was a member of the royal family, long ago, who died tragically and cannot find peace," Rosalind whispered, her voice barely audible. "Some claim he was a prince who was murdered by those who feared his power. Others believe he was a scholar who uncovered secrets that cost him his life. The stories vary, but they all agree on one thing. He appears to certain women, always beautiful, always alone, and always—" She paused, biting her lower lip. "Always engaged to be married to someone else." A chill ran through Mirelle's body that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "What happened to Lady Cordelia?" "You said the engagement was called off suddenly." "She left in the middle of the night," Rosalind said, her voice growing even quieter. "Took nothing with her but the clothes on her back and rode out into a thunderstorm. When they found her the next morning, she was nearly mad with terror, babbling about voices in the walls and hands that touched her in the darkness. She never married, never spoke of what happened here, and died in a convent just 2 years later. The girl straightened up, seeming to shake off the melancholy mood that had settled over them. But I'm sure it was just her imagination, or perhaps the stress of the engagement. These old places can play tricks on the mind, especially when one is feeling uncertain or afraid. Despite Rosalind's reassuring words, Mirelle could not shake the feeling that there was more truth to the girl's story than either of them wanted to acknowledge. As she soaked in the warm, rose-scented bathwater that Rosalind had prepared, she found herself listening intently to every sound the ancient building made around her. The wind did indeed create strange noises as it moved through the corridors, and the settling of old wood and stone produced groans and creaks that could easily be mistaken for footsteps or voices by someone already on edge. By the time she was dressed for dinner in a gown of deep blue velvet that complemented her dark hair and pale complexion, Mirelle had managed to convince herself that she was simply allowing her imagination to run wild due to the stress of her new circumstances. She had always been prone to flights of fancy, preferring the company of books to people, and it was natural that she would find the palace's gothic atmosphere conducive to supernatural speculation. The dining hall was a cavernous space with a vaulted ceiling supported by stone arches, and a table long enough to seat 30 people comfortably. Tonight, however, only 4 places were set at one end, where Queen Isabel sat in regal splendor despite her supposed indisposition. The Queen was a handsome woman in her late 40s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and the same piercing blue eyes that Mirelle had seen in Prince Aldric's portrait. Her manner was gracious but reserved, and she questioned Mirelle politely about her family, her education, and her expectations for married life. Also present were Lord Chancellor Bartholomew Ashford, Lady Evangeline's husband, and their daughter Vivienne, a girl of perhaps 16 with her mother's calculating eyes and a tendency to study Mirelle with uncomfortable intensity. The conversation during dinner was stilted and formal, touching on safe topics like the weather, the harvest, and the latest news from neighboring kingdoms. Mirelle found herself longing for the comfortable silences she had shared with her father during their evening meals, where they could simply enjoy each other's company without the need for constant conversation. "I trust you will find plenty to occupy your time while Prince Aldric is away," Queen Isabel said as the servants cleared away the dessert course. "The palace has an extensive library, and the gardens are quite lovely despite the season. Lady Ashford can arrange for you to take riding lessons if you wish, and there are various charitable activities in the village that might interest you." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Mirelle replied. "I do love reading, and I would be honored to contribute to any charitable works you deem appropriate." "Excellent," the Queen said, though her smile seemed somewhat forced. "I confess I am eager to see you and Aldric settled. He has been resistant to the idea of marriage, claiming he has not yet found a woman who could understand him. But I believe you may be exactly what he needs. You have a quality of stillness about you that should complement his more energetic nature." Lord Ashford cleared his throat delicately. "Speaking of the prince, we have received word that his diplomatic mission is proceeding well, though he may be delayed slightly longer than originally anticipated. There have been some complications with the trade negotiations that require his continued presence." Mirelle nodded politely, though she was not entirely disappointed by the news. The prospect of meeting her future husband filled her with anxiety, and she was grateful for additional time to acclimate herself to palace life before facing that particular challenge. After dinner, she excused herself and returned to her chambers, where she spent an hour writing letters to her father and her best friend describing her arrival and first impressions of the royal household. As she prepared for bed, Mirelle found herself standing before the tall mirror in her bedroom, studying her reflection with critical eyes. She had never considered herself particularly beautiful, though others had often complimented her on her unusual violet eyes and the lustrous quality of her dark hair. Her figure was slender rather than voluptuous, and her features were more refined than striking. She wondered what Prince Aldric would think of her, whether he would find her attractive or merely adequate for the purposes of their arranged marriage. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and the only other light came from the single candle on her bedside table. She had dismissed Rosalind for the evening and was looking forward to the luxury of solitude after the stresses of travel and social interaction. The silk nightgown she wore was one of her finest, a gift from her aunt who had insisted that a future princess must have a trousseau worthy of her station. It was as she was reaching for the candle to extinguish it that she first became aware of the music. The sound was so faint that she initially thought it might be her imagination. But as she stood perfectly still and listened, she could distinctly hear the notes of a melancholy melody being played on what sounded like a perche harpsichord. The music seemed to be coming from somewhere within the walls themselves, as if the very stones of the palace were singing a lament. Mirelle moved to the door and pressed her ear against the wood, but the sound was no clearer there. She tried the French doors leading to the balcony, thinking perhaps the music was drifting up from the gardens, but the night air carried only the whisper of wind through the autumn leaves. The melody continued, beautiful and haunting, filled with a longing that seemed to resonate in her very bones. She found herself humming along softly, though she had never heard the tune before. When the music finally faded away, she stood in the darkness for several minutes, waiting to see if it would return. The silence that followed seemed almost oppressive after the ethereal beauty of the melody, and she realized that her heart was beating faster than normal. There was something about the music that had affected her deeply, stirring emotions she could not quite name. It spoke of love and loss, of yearning and despair, and it left her feeling both exhilarated and melancholy. She returned to bed, but found sleep elusive, her mind continuing to replay the haunting melody, while her body remained tense with unexplained anticipation. When she finally dozed, her dreams were filled with shadowy figures dancing in moonlit ballrooms, their faces obscured but their movements graceful and seductive. She woke several times during the night, each time listening for the return of the mysterious music. But the palace remained silent save for the usual sounds of an old building settling into the darkness. Morning brought bright sunshine and the cheerful bustle of palace life, and in the light of day, Mirelle was able to convince herself that she had simply been overtired and perhaps influenced by Rosalind's stories of supernatural occurrences. She dressed in a simple gown of lavender wool and made her way to the breakfast room, where she found Lady Ashford already seated with a cup of tea and a selection of correspondence. "Good morning, my dear," Lady Ashford said, looking up from her letters. "I hope you slept well despite the unfamiliar surroundings." "Quite well, thank you," Mirelle lied politely, taking a seat across from the older woman. "Though I confess I thought I heard music at some point during the night. Perhaps someone was practicing in one of the other rooms?" Lady Ashford's expression grew carefully neutral, and she set down her teacup with perhaps more force than necessary. "I'm afraid that's quite impossible. The music rooms are located in the West Wing, far from your chambers, and no one would be playing at such a late hour. You must have been dreaming. Or perhaps you heard the wind in the chimney flues. Old buildings can produce the most peculiar sounds." There was something in the woman's tone that suggested she was not being entirely truthful, but Mirelle did not press the matter. Instead, she applied herself to a breakfast of coddled eggs and fresh bread, while Lady Ashford outlined the day's activities. There would be a tour of the palace's public rooms, a visit to the library, and perhaps a walk in the gardens if the weather remained pleasant. She was also to meet with the head seamstress to discuss additions to her wardrobe that would be appropriate for her new station. The tour proved fascinating despite Lady Ashford's obvious desire to hurry through certain sections of the palace. The throne room was magnificent, with its golden ceiling and walls lined with portraits of every king and queen who had ruled from Ravencrest. The ballroom was equally impressive, with crystal chandeliers that caught and scattered light like captured stars, and a floor of polished marble that reflected the dancers' movements during formal occasions. Mirelle found herself wondering if she would be dancing in this room at her own wedding celebration, and the thought filled her with both excitement and trepidation. It was in the portrait gallery that she first saw his face. The painting was older than the others, its colors slightly faded despite obvious efforts at preservation, and it depicted a young man with dark hair and intense gray eyes that seemed to follow her as she moved past. He was dressed in the formal court attire of perhaps 2 centuries ago, with a high collar and elaborate embroidery that spoke of wealth and status. What struck her most forcefully was the expression of profound sadness in those painted eyes, as if the artist had captured a moment of deep personal anguish. "Who is this?" she asked, stopping before the portrait while Lady Ashford continued walking. The older woman turned back with obvious reluctance. Prince Damien Ravencrest, younger brother to King Edmund III. He died quite young, under tragic circumstances, and his portrait was placed here to honor his memory. Her tone suggested that the subject is closed, but Mirelle found herself drawn to study the painting more closely. "He looks so sad," she murmured, almost to herself. "What were the tragic circumstances of his death?" "Ancient history, my dear, and not particularly relevant to your current situation," Lady Ashford said briskly, taking Mirelle's arm and steering her away from the bay. "Portrait. Shall we proceed to the library? I believe you will find the collection quite comprehensive." The library was indeed impressive, with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling and contained volumes on every conceivable subject. Mirelle was delighted to discover entire sections devoted to poetry, literature, and natural philosophy, as well as historical chronicles that documented the kingdom's past in meticulous detail. She selected several books to take back to her chambers, including a volume of romantic poetry and a historical account of the Ravencrest dynasty. That afternoon, while Lady Ashford attended to her administrative duties, Mirelle settled into the window seat of her sitting room with the historical chronicle and began reading about the royal family's past. The early chapters were fairly dry, focusing on political alliances and territorial disputes, but as she progressed through the centuries, she found herself increasingly absorbed in the personal stories of the various monarchs and their families. It was near sunset when she came across the chapter devoted to Prince Damien Ravencrest, and what she read there made her heart race with sudden understanding. According to the chronicler, Prince Damien had been a gifted scholar and musician who had fallen deeply in love with a young noblewoman named Lady Celeste Montclair. Their romance had been passionate but doomed, as Lady Celeste was already promised in marriage to a powerful duke from a neighboring kingdom. The political implications of breaking such an engagement were too significant to ignore, and King Edmund had forbidden his brother from pursuing the relationship. Desperate to be together, the lovers had planned to elope, but their plot was discovered by Lady Celeste's betrothed, who challenged Prince Damien to a duel. The fight took place in the palace gardens at dawn, and though Damien was known to be skilled with a sword, he was found dead with a blade through his heart, while the Duke claimed victory. Lady Celeste, devastated by her lover's death, had thrown herself from the palace battlements that same night, choosing to join him in death rather than face a life without him. The chronicler noted that strange occurrences had begun almost immediately after the tragedy. Servants reported hearing harpsichord music in the early hours of the morning, always the same melancholy melody that had been Prince Damien's favorite composition. Others claimed to have seen his spirit walking the corridors, particularly in the East Wing where he had maintained his private study. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of various young women who had visited the palace over the years, many of them engaged to be married, who had reported being approached by a handsome young man who appeared only at night and spoke of love and loss with heartbreaking eloquence. Mirelle closed the book with trembling hands, her pulse racing as she recalled the haunting music she had heard the previous night. The description of Prince Damien's favorite composition matched perfectly with the melody that had seemed to emanate from the very walls of her chamber. She moved to the window and gazed out at the gardens, where the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and tried to convince herself that the similarities were merely coincidental. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding, and Rosalind entered with a cheerful smile and a dinner tray. "Lady Ashford thought you might prefer to dine in your chambers this evening, since you seemed a bit tired after your tour of the palace," the girl said, setting the tray on the small table near the fireplace. "She also wanted me to remind you that the seamstress will be coming tomorrow morning to take your measurements." "Rosalind," Mirelle said carefully, "how long have you worked at the palace?" "Nearly 4 years now, miss. I started when I was 14, just after my mother died and I needed to find employment." The girl's expression grew curious. "Why do you ask? Have you ever heard music at night? Harpsichord music specifically?" Rosalind's face paled visibly, and she glanced toward the door as if checking to ensure they were alone. "You read it too, didn't you? The sad psalm that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once? You have heard it before?" "Many times, especially when there are young ladies staying in the East Wing." Lady Ashford says it's just the wind or the pipes, but we all know better. Rosalind moved closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. They say it's Prince Damien's spirit, still playing the song he wrote for his lost love. Some of the older servants claim they've seen him too, walking the corridors at night, searching for something he can never find. What does he look like? Mirelle asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Tall and handsome, with dark hair and the saddest gray eyes you've ever seen. He wears the old-fashioned court clothes, with a high collar and silver buttons. They say he speaks to the ladies sometimes, always very polite and proper, but there's something about him that makes them feel different, changed. Rosalind paused, studying Mirelle's face with concern. You're not afraid, are you? Because if you are, I could ask to have you moved to different chambers. The West Wing is supposed to be free of disturbances. No, Mirelle said softly, surprised by her own certainty. I'm not afraid. Curious, perhaps, but not afraid. That night, after Rosalind had helped her prepare for bed and departed for her own quarters, Mirelle found herself unable to settle. She had chosen a nightgown of white silk that seemed to glow in the candlelight, and she had left her hair loose around her shoulders rather than braiding it as was her usual custom. She told herself she was simply more comfortable that way, but some deeper part of her mind acknowledged that she was hoping to encounter the mysterious presence that seemed to inhabit the palace. She did not have to wait long. The harpsichord music began just as the clock in the corridor chimed midnight, the same haunting melody that had captivated her the night before. This time, however, the sound seemed clearer, more immediate, as if the player were in the very next room. Mirelle rose from her bed and moved to the center of the chamber, closing her eyes and allowing the music to wash over her like a tangible presence. When she opened her eyes, he was standing near the fireplace, watching her with those impossibly sad gray eyes that she had memorized from his portrait. He was exactly as Rosalind had described, tall and aristocratically handsome, with dark hair that caught the candlelight and formal attire that belonged to another century. There was something ethereal about his presence, as if he were not quite solid, not quite real, but the intensity of his gaze was undeniably human. "You are not afraid," he said, and his voice was like music itself, deep and resonant with a slight accent that suggested refined education and royal upbringing. "Most women scream when they first see me, or faint, or flee to their chambers and refuse to emerge until daylight. Should I be afraid?" Mirelle asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You don't seem threatening, only sad." A smile ghosted across his lips, transforming his features and making him appear almost luminously beautiful. "Sad, yes. I have been sad for a very long time." He moved closer, and she caught the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, something indefinably masculine and appealing. "You are the lady who is to marry Prince Aldric." "I am promised to him, yes, though we have not yet met." She found herself studying his face, noting the aristocratic line of his jaw and the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. "You are Prince Damien. You know my name." He seemed pleased by this, though the sadness never entirely left his eyes. "I had hoped that history might have forgotten me by now, that my tragic story would fade into obscurity like so many others. The chronicle in the library speaks of your love for Lady Celeste, and of how you both died rather than accept separation." Mirelle moved closer to him, drawn by an impulse she could not name. "It says that you have walked these halls ever since, unable to find peace." "Peace," he repeated, as if the word were foreign to him. "I had almost forgotten what that might feel like. For 200 years, I have existed in this liminal space between life and death, watching the world change around me, while remaining forever trapped in the moment of my greatest loss." He reached out as if to touch her face, then let his hand fall back to his side. "But tonight, for the first time in all those years, I feel something other than despair." "What do you feel?" she whispered. "Hope," he said simply. "When I look at you, I feel hope." They stood in silence for several moments, the space between them charged with an energy that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Mirelle was acutely aware of her own heartbeat. of the way her breath came faster than normal, of the warmth that seemed to radiate from his presence despite his otherworldly nature. She had never experienced such immediate and intense attraction to anyone, living or dead. And the knowledge that he was a spirit did nothing to diminish the pull she felt toward him. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Why do you appear to me when you have remained hidden from so many others?" "I do not remain hidden," he said with a slight smile. "I appear to those who need to see me, those who understand what it means to love completely and without reservation. You have that capacity within you, though you have not yet discovered it. Your heart is not given to the prince you are meant to marry." "I have never met Prince Aldric," she protested. "How can I know whether my heart might come to care for him?" "Because your heart already recognizes its true match," Damien said, moving close enough that she could feel the coolness of his presence against her skin. "As mine recognized yours the moment you entered this palace. We are connected, you and I, by forces older and stronger than the political arrangements that govern mortal life." The implications of his words should have terrified her, but instead, Mirelle felt a strange sense of rightness, as if some missing piece of herself had suddenly clicked into place. She had always felt different from other young, women her age, more drawn to solitude and contemplation than to social gatherings and romantic pursuits. Her friends had often teased her about her tendency to lose herself in romantic poetry and fantastical stories, claiming she was too idealistic for her own good. Perhaps they had been right, and she had been waiting all her life for something that could only exist in the realm of the impossible. "What are you asking of me?" she said, though part of her already knew the answer. "I am asking you to choose," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can continue on the path that has been laid out for you, marry Prince Aldric, and live the life that others have planned. Or you can choose to love completely, without reservation, even if that love can never be sanctioned by the mortal world." "You're asking me to choose between the living and the dead," she said, and the words sounded surreal even as she spoke them. "I am asking you to choose between duty and desire, between safety and passion, between the life you are expected to live and the life your heart truly wants." His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to burn through her very soul. "I cannot offer you a conventional future, but I can offer you a love that transcends death itself." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her door broke the spell that had woven itself around them. Damien's form began to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial, though his eyes remained fixed on hers until the very last moment. "Think on what I have said," his voice echoed in her mind even as his physical presence disappeared. "I will return tomorrow night, and every night thereafter, until you give me your answer." Mirelle stood alone in her chamber, her heart racing and her thoughts in turmoil. The footsteps in the corridor had passed by without stopping, probably just a servant making late-night rounds. But their interruption had shattered the otherworldly atmosphere that had surrounded her encounter with the ghostly prince. She moved to the window and stared out at the moonlit gardens, trying to process what had just occurred. Logic told her that she had experienced some sort of waking dream brought on by stress and the power of suggestion. She was in a strange place, engaged to a man she had never met, and her mind was simply creating elaborate fantasies to cope with the uncertainty of her situation. The historical account she had read about Prince Damien had obviously influenced her subconscious, causing her to conjure up a romantic vision of the long-dead prince as a way of avoiding the reality of her impending marriage. But even as she tried to rationalize the experience, she could not deny the visceral reality of what she had felt in his presence. The attraction had been immediate and overwhelming, unlike anything she had ever experienced with any living man. More than that, there had been a sense of creatine, recognition, as if her soul had been searching for his across centuries and had finally found its match. The very idea should have been absurd, but it felt more real than anything else in her carefully ordered life. She returned to her bed but knew that sleep would be impossible. Her body hummed with energy, and her mind raced with questions that had no rational answers. What did it mean to fall in love with a ghost? Could such a relationship ever be more than a beautiful delusion? And what would happen to her carefully planned future if she chose to pursue something that existed outside the boundaries of normal human experience? The next morning brought gray skies and a cold rain that matched Mirelle's unsettled mood. She found herself distracted during her fitting with the seamstress, giving vague responses to questions about sleeve length and neckline preferences, while her thoughts remained focused on the encounter with Prince Damien. The seamstress, a practical woman named Mrs. Hartwell, seemed to notice her preoccupation but attributed it to bridal nerves, and offered reassuring comments about how lovely she would look in her wedding gown. "Prince Aldric is a fortunate young man," Mrs. Hartwell said as she pinned the hem of a new day dress. "You have the kind of beauty that improves with age, not the flashy sort that fades quickly. He'll appreciate that in a wife. Mark my words." Mirelle nodded politely, though the mention of her future husband filled her with a strange sense of guilt. She had agreed to marry Prince Aldric in good faith, understanding that their union would benefit both their families and kingdoms. It seemed wrong to be having romantic thoughts about another man, even if that man was long dead and their relationship could never be consummated in any conventional sense. After the fitting, she spent the afternoon in the library, ostensibly researching the history of the kingdom but actually searching for any additional information about Prince Damien and Lady Celeste. She found several other references to their tragic love story, each one adding small details that made their doomed romance feel more real and immediate. One account mentioned that Damien had been an accomplished composer who had written dozens of pieces, but only one had survived, the melancholy harpsichord melody that servants still claimed to hear on quiet nights. Another chronicle described Lady Celeste as a woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence who had been known for her charitable works and her devotion to poetry. The parallels between her situation and Mirelle's were impossible to ignore. Both were noble women promised to men they did not love. Both had been drawn into the palace's web of political intrigue, and both had encountered Prince Damien during their time of greatest vulnerability. As evening approached, Mirelle found herself growing increasingly anxious about the possibility of another supernatural encounter. Part of her longed to see Damien again, to explore the connection she had felt between them, but another part warned her that she was playing with forces beyond her understanding. The rational portion of her mind insisted that she was allowing herself to be seduced by a romantic fantasy that could only lead to heartbreak and ruin. She dressed for dinner with particular care, choosing a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her dark hair and pale complexion. If Prince Damien did appear again, she wanted to look her best, though she tried to convince herself that her choice of attire was simply a matter of personal pride. Rosalind helped arrange her hair in an elaborate style that left soft tendrils framing her face, and applied a subtle touch of rose-colored lip salve that made her mouth appear fuller and more inviting. Dinner was a more intimate affair than the previous evening, with only Queen Isabel and Lady Ashford in attendance. The Queen seemed in better spirits, asking detailed questions about Mirelle's impressions of the palace and her thoughts on various improvements that might be made to the East Wing chambers. There was something in the older woman's manner that suggested she was probing for information, though Mirelle could not determine what specifically she might be seeking. "I trust you are sleeping well," Queen Isabel said as they finished the main course. "Old buildings can be rather noisy at night, and I know some guests find the unfamiliar sounds disturbing." "I slept quite peacefully, thank you," Mirelle replied, though the lie came less easily than it had the day before. "The chambers are very comfortable, and I find the quiet rather soothing after the bustle of my father's household." Lady Ashford exchanged a meaningful glance with the Queen, and Mirelle had the distinct impression that her response had not been what they were expecting. "Excellent," the Queen said smoothly. "I am pleased to hear it. We want you to feel completely at home here, as this will be your permanent residence once you and Aldric are married." The reminder of her impending marriage sat heavily on Mirelle's conscience, as she returned to her chambers after dinner. She had accepted Prince Aldric's proposal in good faith, understanding that their union would provide security for her family and strengthen diplomatic ties between their kingdoms. Her father had stressed the importance of the alliance, explaining that their modest estate was struggling financially and that her marriage to royalty would ensure her mother's comfort in her declining years. Yet now, faced with the possibility of a love that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience, she found herself questioning everything she had previously accepted as inevitable. Was it fair to marry Prince Aldric when her heart was already engaged elsewhere? Could she build a life with him while knowing that another claimed her deepest affections? The questions tormented her as she prepared for bed, donning another of her finest nightgowns and leaving her hair loose around her shoulders. She did not have to wait long for answers. As the palace settled into nighttime quiet, the familiar strains of harpsichord music began to drift through her chambers, more beautiful and haunting than ever before. This time, when Prince Damien materialized near the fireplace, he seemed more solid, more present, as if their previous encounter had somehow strengthened his ability to manifest in the physical world. "You came back," she said softly, moving toward him with less hesitation than she had shown the night before. "Did you doubt but I would?" His smile was warmer tonight, less tinged with the profound sadness that had marked their first meeting. "I have waited 2 centuries for you, Mirelle. A few hours more is nothing. You speak as if you know me, but we have only just met." She stopped just out of arm's reach, close enough to see the subtle variations of gray in his eyes, the way his dark hair caught the candlelight, the aristocratic line of his features. "How can you be so certain that I am the one you have been waiting for?" "Because you are here," he said simply. "Because you see me not as a terrifying specter to be feared, but as a man to be understood. Because when you look at me, I feel alive again for the first time in 200 years. He moved closer, and she could feel the strange coolness that seemed to emanate from his presence. "Tell me, when you think of your future with Prince Aldric, what do you feel?" Mirelle considered the question carefully, searching her heart for honest answers. "Uncertainty," she admitted. "Anxiety about whether we will find common ground, whether he will be kind to me, whether I can learn to care for him as a wife should. I feel resigned to making the best of a situation that was chosen for me rather than by me. And when you think of me?" The answer came without hesitation, rising from some deep well of truth within her heart. "I feel alive," she whispered. "I feel as if every moment of my life before now has been preparation for this. I feel—" She paused, struggling to find words for emotions that seemed to exist beyond the realm of ordinary language. "I feel complete." Damien's expression grew tender, and he reached out to touch her face with fingers that felt like cool silk against her skin. "That is how I felt the first time I saw Lady Celeste," he said softly. The recognition was immediate and absolute. I knew that she was the other half of my soul, the missing piece that would make me whole. "What happened to her?" Mirelle asked, though she already knew the tragic outcome from her research. The chronicles say she threw herself from the battlements, but they don't explain why she couldn't simply refuse the marriage that was arranged for her. "Because refusal was not an option," Damien replied, his expression growing dark with remembered pain. Her family's lands bordered those of Duke Roderick, and tensions between their territories had been escalating for years. The marriage was meant to secure peace and prevent open warfare. If Celeste had broken the engagement, hundreds of innocent people would have died in the conflicts that followed. So, she chose death rather than sacrifice others for her own happiness. "She chose love," he corrected gently. "She chose to join me in whatever realm awaited us beyond death rather than live a life of compromise and regret. In the end, that choice doomed us both to this existence between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead." Mirelle felt tears prick at her eyes as she contemplated the magnitude of the sacrifice Lady Celeste had made. "Do you regret it? Do you wish she had chosen differently?" "Every day," Damien admitted. "But not because I wanted her to live without me. I regret it because our selfishness trapped us in this half-existence where we can never truly be together. Death should have been our gateway to eternal union. But instead, it became another form of separation." "Where is she now? Lady Celeste, I mean. If you are both spirits bound to this place, why are ye together?" The pain that crossed Damien's features was so profound that Mirelle instinctively reached out to comfort him, her hand passing through his arm as if he were made of moonlight and shadow. "She moved on," he said quietly. "Whatever power kept me anchored to this world released her decades ago. I felt her presence fade gradually, like a candle being slowly extinguished, until one day she was simply gone. I have been alone ever since, watching the world change around me while remaining forever frozen in the moment of my greatest loss." "Then why haven't you moved on as well? What keeps you bound here?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond her shoulder, as if he were seeing into a past that existed only in his memory. "I think," he said finally, "that I remained because I was waiting for you. Not Celeste's return, but someone new, someone who could understand the depth of what I felt for her, and might be willing to experience that same intensity of connection." The implications of his words sent a thrill of both excitement and terror through Mirelle's body. "You're asking me to love you the way she did. I'm asking you to love me the way you were meant to love," he replied, moving closer until she could feel the ethereal energy that surrounded him like a second skin. Not with the careful, measured affection that duty requires, but with the wild, passionate devotion that transforms everything it touches. "And what would happen if I did? Would I be trapped here with you for eternity, neither alive nor dead? I don't know," he admitted with devastating honesty. "The rules that govern my existence are not clearly defined. It's possible that true love might finally allow me to find peace and pass on to whatever comes next. It's equally possible that it might bind you to this realm as it bound me. I can only promise you that whatever happens, we would face it together." Mirelle turned away from him, moving to the window where moonlight streamed through the glass and painted silver patterns on the floor. The garden below was a maze of shadows and light, beautiful and mysterious in equal measure, much like the choice that lay before her. She could feel Damien's presence behind her, patient and waiting, making no attempt to pressure her decision. "If I choose you," she said without turning around, "what happens to Prince Aldric? What happens to the alliance between our kingdoms, to my family's security, to all the people who are counting on this marriage to bring stability and prosperity? Those are questions only." "You can answer," Damien replied gently. "I cannot make this choice for you, nor would I want to. The decision must come from your own heart, with full understanding of the consequences." She stood in silence for several minutes, weighing duty against desire, security against passion, the known against the unknowable. Her entire life had been a preparation for the role she was expected to play as Prince Aldric's wife and eventually queen. She had been educated in languages, diplomacy, household management, and all the other skills that would serve her in that position. Her family's future depended on her fulfilling those expectations, and countless subjects would benefit from the peace and prosperity that her marriage would bring. Yet when she tried to imagine herself in that life, going through the motions of royal duty while her heart belonged to someone she could never acknowledge, the prospect filled her with despair. How could she be a good wife and queen when her thoughts would always be elsewhere? How could she give Prince Aldric the devotion he deserved when her deepest affections were already engaged? "I need time," she said finally, turning back to face Damien. "This is not a decision I can make lightly, no matter what my heart might be telling me." "Time is something I have in abundance," he replied with a gentle smile. "I have waited 2 centuries for you. I can wait a little longer for your answer. But I hope you will allow me to continue visiting you, to let me show you what we could have together." "What do you mean?" "Tomorrow night, if you are willing, I would like to take you dancing." His gray eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief. "There is a ballroom in the abandoned wing of the palace where the moonlight streams through crystal windows and creates the most beautiful patterns on the floor. I have not danced in 200 years, but I remember every step of every dance that was popular in my time." The invitation was so unexpected and charming that Mirelle found herself smiling despite the weight of her situation. "I would like that," she admitted, "though I should warn you that my dancing skills are rather rusty. I have not attended many balls." "Then it will be my pleasure to refresh your memory," Damien said, moving closer until he could have kissed her if he had been solid enough to do so. "Until tomorrow night, my dear Mirelle. Dream of moonlight and music, and perhaps you will find the clarity you seek." He faded away gradually, his form becoming translucent and then invisible, but she continued to feel his presence for several minutes after he had disappeared from sight. When she was finally alone, Mirelle sank into the chair by the fireplace and tried to process everything that had transpired. The rational part of her mind insisted that she was losing her grip on reality. That grief over leaving her childhood home and anxiety about her impending marriage were causing her to retreat into elaborate fantasies. But her heart knew better. Whatever Prince Damien was, ghost, spirit, or something else entirely, her feelings for him were undeniably real. The connection she felt when she looked into his eyes transcended anything she had ever experienced or even imagined possible. It was as if they had known each other across lifetimes, as if her soul had been searching for his since the moment of her birth. The next day passed in a haze of distraction and anticipation. Mirelle went through the motions of her daily activities: breakfast with Lady Ashford, a walk in the Ma's gardens, correspondence with her family, but her thoughts remained focused on the evening's promised encounter. She found herself wondering what the abandoned ballroom would look like, what dances Damien would teach her, whether the connection between them would grow stronger or fade under the pressure of extended interaction. Rosalind noticed her preoccupation during their afternoon tea and commented on her distracted manner. "You seem different today, miss," the girl said with concern. I don't know how to describe it. Like you're listening to music that no one else can hear." The observation was more perceptive than Rosalind probably realized, and Mirelle had to fight the urge to confide in her. Instead, she deflected with questions about the palace's layout, particularly the sections that were no longer in regular use. She learned that the West Wing had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, ever since a fire had damaged several rooms, and the royal family had decided the space was not worth the expense of restoration. "Lady Ashford doesn't like the servants going into that section," Rosalind said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "She says it's dangerous because of structural damage from the fire, but some of us think it's because of the strange things that happen there. Lights that appear in empty rooms, footsteps in corridors that should be deserted, music that seems to come from nowhere." "What kind of music?" Mirelle asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Dance music mostly. Waltzes and quadrilles, the kind they used to play at royal balls. Sometimes it's so clear and beautiful that you can't help but want to follow the sound, but it always stops just as you're getting close to the source." That evening, Mirelle spent extra time preparing for her supernatural rendezvous. She chose a gown of midnight blue silk that complemented her dark hair and pale skin, and she allowed Rosalind to arrange her hair in an elaborate style with pearl pins that caught the candlelight. The girl complimented her appearance but seemed puzzled by the formality of her attire for an evening spent alone in her chambers. "Are you expecting visitors, miss?" Rosalind asked as she fastened a sapphire necklace around Mirelle's throat. "You look beautiful enough for a royal ball." "I simply felt like dressing nicely," Mirelle replied, studying her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, more vibrant and alive than the subdued young lady who had arrived at the palace just days before. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation, and there was a flush of color in her cheeks that spoke of excitement rather than nervousness. After Rosalind departed, Mirelle paced her chambers restlessly, waiting for the appointed hour. She had no idea how Damien would manifest this time, whether he would simply appear as he had before, or whether their planned excursion would require some different form of supernatural transportation. The question seemed absurd even to her own mind, but then again, nothing about her current situation fell within the realm of normal human experience. At precisely midnight, the familiar strains of harpsichord music began to drift through her chambers, but this time the melody was different, livelier and more complex, clearly meant for dancing rather than solitary contemplation. Prince Damien materialized near the French doors leading to her balcony, dressed in formal evening wear that would have been fashionable in his own time. He looked magnificent, every inch the aristocratic prince, and when he bowed deeply and extended his hand to her, Mirelle felt her heart skip a beat. "My lady," he said with courtly formality, "would you do me the honor of allowing me to escort you to the ball?" She placed her hand in his, marveling at the strange sensation of touching something that felt simultaneously real and insubstantial. "I would be delighted, Your Highness," she replied, falling naturally into the formal patterns of speech that seemed appropriate for their otherworldly courtship. What happened next defied every law of physics that Mirelle had ever learned. Instead of leading her through the door, Damien drew her close to his side, and suddenly they were moving, not walking but gliding through the air as if they were nothing more than wisps of moonlight. The walls of her chambers faded away around them, replaced by corridors she had never seen before, hung with tapestries that glowed with their own inner light and lined with portraits of people who seemed to watch their passage with knowing smiles. They came to rest in a ballroom that took Mirelle's breath away with its ethereal beauty. Crystal windows stretched from floor to ceiling, and moonlight streamed through them to create shifting patterns of silver and shadow on the marble floor. Chandeliers that had once held hundreds of candles now blazed with supernatural light that cast no heat, illuminated every corner of the vast space. The walls were lined with mirrors that reflected not their physical forms but something deeper, the essence of who they truly were beneath the surface presentations of mortality. Death. "Welcome to my domain," Damien said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "This is where I come when the weight of my existence becomes too heavy to bear. Here, time has no meaning, and the constraints of the physical world hold no power." Mirelle turned slowly, taking in every detail of the magnificent room. "It's beautiful," she breathed, "like something from a fairy tale." "All the best love stories are fairy tales at heart," he replied, moving to stand before her with perfect posture and extending his hand in the formal position for a waltz. "Shall we dance, my lady? I have been composing melodies in my mind for 2 centuries, and tonight I would like to share them with you." She placed her hand in his and allowed him to guide her into the opening movements of a waltz that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the ballroom with rich harmonies that made her feel as if she were floating rather than merely dancing. Damien was an exquisite partner, leading her through complex steps with such skill and grace that she felt like a princess in one of the romantic stories she had loved as a child. As they danced, he told her stories of his mortal life, describing the balls and celebrations that had once filled this very room with life and laughter. He spoke of his education, his travels to foreign courts, his passion for music and literature, painting a picture of a man who had been fully engaged with the world around him before tragedy struck. Mirelle found herself sharing her own experiences in return, describing her quiet childhood on her father's estate, her love of reading and gardening, her dreams of a life that would be meaningful rather than merely comfortable. "You have a poet's soul," Damien observed as they moved through the steps of an intricate quadrille. "I can see it in the way you describe even simple things, how you find beauty and meaning in experiences that others might overlook." "My governess always said I was too fanciful for my own good," Mirelle replied with a self-deprecating smile. She worried that I would never be practical enough to manage a household or satisfy a husband. "Your governess was a fool," Damien said with such vehemence that Mirelle looked at him in surprise. The ability to see magic in the everyday world is a gift, not a flaw. Prince Aldric would be fortunate indeed to have a wife who could bring such wonder to his life. The mention of her intended husband cast a shadow over the magical evening, reminding Mirelle of the complications that awaited her in the world beyond this enchanted ballroom. "Do you really think I should marry him?" she asked as they concluded their dance and stood facing each other in the center of the room. "I think you should follow your heart," Damien replied, though she could see the cost of such objectivity in his expression. "If your heart tells you that Prince Aldric could make you happy, that you could build a fulfilling life together, then you should marry him with my blessing. And if my heart tells me something else entirely?" He moved closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the coolness of his supernatural presence against her skin. "Then you must decide whether you have the courage to choose love over duty, passion over security, the unknown over the predictable." "Show me," she whispered, hardly believing her own boldness. "Show me what love could be like between us." Damien's expression grew tender and infinitely sad. "I cannot offer you the physical consummation that should accompany such feelings," he said softly. "I am not solid enough for such intimacies, not substantial enough to give you the fullness of experience that you deserve." "I don't care about that," Mirelle said. I was surprised to discover that she meant it completely. "Physical passion is only one component of love. There are other ways to be intimate, other ways to share ourselves completely with another person." "Are you certain?" His voice held a note of wonder, as if he had not dared to hope that she might feel this way. because once I show you the depth of what I feel for you, there will be no going back. You will never be able to settle for the shallow affection that duty-bound marriages provide." "I'm certain," she said, reaching up to touch his face with hands that trembled slightly despite her resolve. "Show me what it means to love without reservation." What followed was unlike anything Mirelle had ever experienced or imagined possible. Damien drew her close, and though his embrace was cool and insubstantial, it filled her with a warmth that seemed to radiate from her very soul. When he kissed her, it was like being touched by starlight. Gentle and ethereal, but somehow more real than any physical contact she had ever known. She felt as if she were dissolving into him, as if the boundaries between their separate selves were melting away to reveal the deeper unity that connected them. In that mystical union, she experienced not just his love for her, but his entire existence to her. Centuries of loneliness and yearning, the memory of his mortal life, and his passion for Lady Celeste, the agony of his death, and the strange twilight existence that had followed. At the same time, she felt him experiencing her life through her eyes, understanding double her hopes and fears, her dreams and disappointments, the quiet desperation that had driven her to accept an arranged marriage rather than risk remaining a spinster dependent on her family's charity. When they finally separated, Mirelle was crying without realizing it, overwhelmed by the intensity of their connection. "Is that how you loved Lady Celeste?" she asked through her tears. "No," Damien replied, and his voice held a note of amazement. "What I felt for Celeste was the desperate passion of youth, beautiful but incomplete. What I feel for you is the mature love of a soul that has learned the true value of connection. With her, I was consumed by the fear of loss. With you, I am filled with gratitude for the gift of recognition." They spent the remainder of the night in that enchanted ballroom, dancing and talking and sharing the kind of intimate conversation that most couples never achieve, even after years of marriage. Damien told her about the music he had composed, the books he had written but never published, the philosophical questions that had occupied his thoughts during his long exile from the world of the living. Mirelle found herself opening up in ways she never had before, sharing her deepest thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. As dawn approached, she began to feel the pull of her physical body back in her chambers, and she knew their magical interlude was coming to an end. "Will I see you again tonight?" she asked as the ballroom began to fade around them. "If you wish it," Damien replied, though his form was already becoming translucent. "But I must warn you that each encounter will make the choice you face more difficult. The deeper your feelings for me become, the harder it will be to walk away." "And what if I don't want to walk away? Then we will face whatever consequences arise together," he said, his voice growing faint as they returned to the ordinary world. "But remember, my darling Mirelle, that love without sacrifice is mere infatuation. True love requires the willingness to give up everything for the beloved's happiness." She woke in her own bed with tears on her cheeks and the taste of starlight on her lips, uncertain whether she had experienced the most beautiful dream of her life or the most dangerous reality. The sapphire necklace she had worn to the supernatural ball lay on her bedside table, though she had no memory of removing it, and her evening gown hung in the wardrobe with the fresh scent of night-blooming jasmine clinging to its folds. The next few days passed in a blur of conflicted emotions and intense introspection. Mirelle went through the motions of her daily routine, but her thoughts remained focused on her nocturnal encounters with Prince Damien. During the day, surrounded by the solid reality of palace life, she could almost convince herself that the entire experience had been an elaborate fantasy brought on by stress and isolation. But each night, when the harpsichord music began and Damien materialized in her chambers, the connection between them grew stronger and more undeniable. He took her on adventures through parts of the palace that existed only in the realm of spirits, showed her gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors and fountains sang with voices like silver bells. They spent hours in a library that contained every book that had ever been written, including volumes that existed only in the imaginations of their authors. He introduced her to other spirits who wandered the palace halls, servants and nobles from bygone eras who had found themselves unable to move on to whatever lay beyond death. Through these encounters, Mirelle began to understand that the palace was layered with history and memory, that the present-day reality she experienced during daylight hours was only one dimension of a much more complex existence. The servants' stories of supernatural occurrences were not mere superstition but glimpses into a parallel world that existed alongside the ordinary one, populated by souls who had been unable to find peace. "Why can't they move on?" she asked Damien one night, as they watched a group of ghostly courtiers performing an elaborate dance in a ballroom that had been demolished 50 years earlier. "What keeps them bound to this place?" "Unfinished business," he replied, his arm around her waist as they observed the spectral revelry. "Unresolved emotions, promises that were never kept, love that was never properly expressed or received. Death should be a release, but sometimes the ties that bind us to life are stronger than the forces that would carry us into the unknown." "Is that what keeps you here? Unfinished business with Lady Celeste?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing spirits. "I used to think so," he said finally. "I believed that I remained because I could not accept her death, because I was waiting for some impossible reunion. But I think now that I was waiting for you, for the opportunity to experience love as it was meant to be, rather than love as I understood it in my youth." "What's the difference? Youthful love is selfish," he explained, turning to face her with those impossibly expressive gray eyes. "It demands possession, requires constant validation, fears abandonment above all else. Mature love is selfless. It wants only the beloved's happiness, even if that happiness must be found with someone else." His words sent a chill through Mirelle's heart, because she recognized the truth in them and understood what he was trying to tell her. "You're going to encourage me to marry Prince Aldric. I'm going to encourage you to choose whatever path will bring you the greatest fulfillment," he said gently. "If that path leads to Prince Aldric, but I will find a way to be happy for you. If it leads elsewhere—" He paused, cupping her face in his cool, insubstantial hands. "Then we will face the consequences together, whatever they might be." The weight of decision pressed down on Mirelle's shoulders like a physical burden. She had been at the palace for nearly 2 weeks, and word had come that Prince Aldric would be returning within days. Soon she would have to meet her intended husband, evaluate their compatibility, and decide whether to proceed with their planned marriage or find some way to extricate herself from the arrangement without causing a diplomatic crisis. The prospect of meeting Prince Aldric filled her with anxiety rather than anticipation. How could she fairly assess her feelings for a living man when her heart was already engaged by a supernatural lover? How could she give him the consideration he deserved, when every moment of their interaction would be colored by comparison to the otherworldly romance she had discovered in the palace's shadowy corners? Her dilemma was complicated by the arrival of a letter from her father, expressing his eagerness to hear news of her progress with Prince Aldric and his hopes that the marriage would proceed as scheduled. He wrote of financial pressures that had grown more severe in her absence, creditors who were becoming increasingly impatient, and his concerns about her mother's declining health. The marriage settlement would resolve all these problems, but only if the wedding took place as planned. "Troubling news from home?" Lady Ashford asked, noticing Mirelle's distressed expression as she finished reading the letter over breakfast. "My father writes of some difficulties with the estate," Mirelle replied carefully. "Nothing that cannot be resolved, but I confess I am anxious about being so far from home during a challenging time." "All the more reason to be grateful for Prince Aldric's return," the older woman said with a smile. That seemed slightly forced. "Once you are married, you will have the resources of the royal treasury at your disposal, and I am certain the prince will be generous in assisting your family through any temporary difficulties." The reminder of the practical benefits of her marriage only added to Mirelle's internal conflict. She had been raised to consider duty and family responsibility above personal desires, and the knowledge that her romantic choices could have serious consequences for people she loved made the decision even more complicated. Could she justify choosing her own happiness over her family's security? Was it fair to pursue a relationship that might exist only in her imagination while abandoning real people who depended on her? That night, she poured out her concerns to Damien as they walked through a moonlit garden that existed somewhere between the physical and spiritual realms. The flowers here bloomed in colors that had no names, and their perfume carried memories of every love story that had ever unfolded within the palace walls. It was a place of profound beauty and melancholy, perfectly suited to the conversation they needed to have. "I feel as if I am being torn in two," she confessed as they paused beside a fountain where the water sang with voices from ages past. "My heart belongs to you completely, but my conscience tells me that I have obligations to others that must take precedence over personal desire." "Your conscience is wise," Damien replied, though she could see the pain her breath. Words caused him. "Love that demands the sacrifice of innocent others is not worthy of the name. True love requires that we consider the greater good, not just our own happiness." "Then you think I should marry Prince Aldric?" The question came out more sharply than she had intended, colored by frustration and disappointment. "I think you should meet him first," Damien said with a sad smile. "You may find that your fears are unfounded, that he is a man you could genuinely care for given time and opportunity. If that proves to be the case, then you should marry him with a clear conscience and my blessing." "And if it doesn't? What if I find him cold or cruel or simply incompatible with my nature?" "Then we will find another solution," he promised, drawing her into his ethereal embrace. "Love as deep as ours does not simply disappear because circumstances are complicated. If you cannot be happy with Prince Aldric, then we will discover a way for you to be happy with me, regardless of the obstacles." His words should have comforted her, but instead they filled her with a new kind of dread. What if there was no satisfactory solution? What if every choice available to her required the sacrifice of someone else's well-being? The weight of responsibility seemed crushing, and she found herself wishing she could simply disappear into the spirit realm permanently, leaving behind all the complications of mortal existence. The next morning brought news that Prince Aldric's party had been sighted on the roads leading to the palace and would arrive by evening. The announcement sent the entire household into a flurry of preparation, with servants rushing to ensure that every detail was perfect for the prince's return. Lady Ashford supervised the arrangements with military precision, while Queen Isabel emerged from her private apartments to oversee the menu for the welcome dinner and approve the decorations for the receiving hall. Mirelle spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, trying on and discarding multiple gowns before finally settling on one of deep burgundy silk that complemented her dark hair and pale complexion. Rosalind noticed her anxiety and offered reassuring words about Prince Aldric's character, though the girl's attempts at comfort only served to highlight how little anyone really knew about the man Mirelle was expected to marry. "He's quite handsome," Rosalind said as she arranged Mirelle's hair in an elaborate style befitting the occasion. "And the servants who traveled with him on his diplomatic mission say he was always courteous and considerate, never harsh with those below his station." "That's encouraging," Mirelle replied, though her heart continued to race with nervousness. "I suppose I should be grateful that he appears to be a decent man, regardless of whether we prove compatible in other ways." As evening approached, the palace buzzed with excitement and activity. Trumpets announced Prince Aldric's arrival as his carriage rolled through the gates, and the royal household assembled in the great hall to welcome him home. Mirelle took her place beside Queen Isabel, trying to calm her racing pulse and prepare herself for the moment that would determine the course of her future. The great doors swung open, and Prince Aldric strode into the hall with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to command. He was indeed handsome, as Rosalind had promised, with the piercing blue eyes she had seen in his portrait and thick blonde hair that caught the light from the chandeliers. His features were strong and aristocratic, and his tall frame was shown to advantage by the well-tailored traveling clothes he wore. Yet as Mirelle studied him, she felt none of the immediate attraction that had struck her so powerfully upon first seeing Prince Damien. Prince Aldric's gaze swept the assembled courtiers before settling on his mother, and his expression softened into genuine warmth as he approached the royal dais. "Mother," he said, bowing formally before embracing Queen Isabel with obvious affection. "I have missed you terribly during these long weeks away." "Welcome home, my son," the Queen replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Your diplomatic mission was successful, I trust?" "More than successful," Prince Aldric confirmed, his voice carrying the cultured tones of excellent education and noble birth. The trade agreements have been signed, and our northern borders are more secure than they have been in decades. His eyes moved to Mirelle, and she felt herself being assessed with the same careful consideration he might give to a political treaty. And this must be Lady Mirelle. He approached her with measured steps, his expression politely interested but not particularly warm. When he took her hand and brought it to his lips in the traditional greeting, his touch was firm and warm, but stirred no deeper feelings within her heart. She curtsied gracefully, murmuring the appropriate words of welcome, while her mind compared this conventional courtship ritual to the ethereal intimacy she had shared with Damien. "Lady Mirelle," Prince Aldric said, his blue eyes studying her face with intelligence and something that might have been approval. "Your reputation for beauty and accomplishment preceded you, but I confess the reality exceeds even the most glowing reports. I am honored to make your acquaintance at last." "The honor is mine, Your Highness," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite her inner turmoil. "I hope your journey was not too arduous. Nothing that good company and the promise of home could not make bearable," he said with a smile that transformed his rather stern features. "I understand you have been here for nearly a fortnight. I trust you have found the palace to your liking?" "Very much so," Mirelle answered, though she could not help but think of the parts of the palace he would never see, the supernatural realm where she had discovered a love that transcended the boundaries between life and death. "Your family has been most welcoming, and I have enjoyed exploring the gardens and library." "Excellent," Prince Aldric said, though she sensed that his attention was already moving to other matters. "We shall have to spend time together tomorrow, so that we may become better acquainted before we make any final arrangements regarding our future." The phrase, "final arrangements," struck Mirelle as oddly businesslike, as if their marriage were merely another diplomatic negotiation to be concluded. She supposed that from his perspective, it was exactly the strategic alliance that would benefit both their kingdoms while fulfilling his duty to produce heirs for the throne. The knowledge that he viewed their relationship in such practical terms should have relieved her anxiety, but instead it only highlighted the vast difference between duty-bound affection and the transcendent love she had discovered with Damien. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, with multiple courses and carefully orchestrated conversation designed to showcase the royal family's sophistication and prosperity. Prince Aldric proved to be an intelligent and well-informed conversationalist, speaking knowledgeably about politics, literature, and current events. He asked Mirelle thoughtful questions about her own interests and opinions, listening to her responses with apparent attention and respect. Yet despite his obvious efforts to be charming and considerate, Mirelle found herself feeling increasingly disconnected from the proceedings. She performed her role as the prospective bride competently, making appropriate responses and displaying the social graces she had been taught since childhood, but her heart remained elsewhere. When Prince Aldric complimented her on her musical knowledge, she thought of the supernatural melodies that had first drawn her to Damien. When he spoke of his plans for modernizing the kingdom's agricultural practices, she remembered dancing in moonlit gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in colors beyond mortal comprehension. "I hope you will not think me too forward," Prince Aldric said as the evening drew to a close. "But I wondered if you might care to ride with me tomorrow morning. I am eager to show you some of the estate grounds that are not visible from the palace windows, and I thought it might provide us with an opportunity for private conversation." "I would be delighted," Mirelle replied, though the prospect filled her with more dread than anticipation. She knew that their private conversation would likely focus on the terms of their engagement and marriage, topics that would require her to make decisions she was not yet prepared to face. After bidding goodnight to the royal family, Mirelle returned to her chambers in a state of profound confusion. Prince Aldric was everything she should want in a husband: handsome, intelligent, well-educated, and apparently kind. His conversation had been engaging, his manner courteous, and his obvious affection for his mother suggested that he was capable of deep emotional attachment. Any reasonable woman would consider herself fortunate to marry such a man. Yet as she prepared for bed, Mirelle felt nothing but emptiness where excitement should have been. Meeting Prince Aldric had confirmed her worst fears, that duty and love were incompatible forces in her life, that she could not give her heart to someone simply because circumstances demanded it. The contrast between her tepid response to him and her passionate connection with Damien only served to emphasize how completely her affections were already engaged elsewhere. She dismissed Rosalind early, claiming fatigue from the evening's festivities, and spent long minutes standing before her mirror, studying her reflection and wondering what kind of woman she was becoming. The face looking back at her seemed changed somehow, more mature and knowing than the girl who had arrived at the palace just 2 weeks earlier. Her eyes held secrets now, and her mouth bore the trace of a smile that spoke of mysteries and forbidden knowledge. When the harpsichord music began at midnight, she felt her pulse quicken with anticipation rather than surprise. Prince Damien materialized near the fireplace, but tonight his expression was somber rather than welcoming, and she sensed that he already knew about her encounter with Prince Aldric. "You have met your intended husband," he said without preamble, his gray eyes searching her face for clues to her emotional state. "What did you think of him?" Mirelle moved closer, drawn as always by the magnetic pull of his presence. "He is everything I expected," she said carefully. "Handsome, intelligent, well-mannered. Any woman would be fortunate to marry him. But you are not any woman," Damien observed, and there was both hope and sadness in his voice. "You are the woman I love, the woman who has shown me that connection can transcend death itself. What did your heart tell you when you looked at him?" "Nothing," she admitted, and the word came out like a confession of guilt. "I felt respect for his character and appreciation for his courtesy, but there was no spark of attraction, no sense of recognition or connection. When he took my hand, I felt only the touch of a stranger." Damien's expression grew tender, and he reached out to cup her face in his cool, ethereal hands. "I am sorry," he said softly. "I had hoped that meeting him might resolve your dilemma, that you might discover genuine feelings for him that would make your choice clear. Instead, it has only made everything more complicated," Mirelle said, leaning into his touch despite its insubstantial nature. "I am riding with him tomorrow morning, and I suspect he intends to discuss our engagement in earnest. How can I give him the consideration he deserves when my heart belongs completely to you?" "You must try," Damien said, though she could see the cost of such advice in his expression. "Prince Aldric is innocent in all of this. He deserves honesty about your feelings, even if that honesty leads to the dissolution of your engagement. And what of my family? What of the political consequences if I refuse to marry him?" The questions that had been tormenting her all evening poured out in a rush. "My father is counting on this marriage to save our estate. The alliance between our kingdoms depends on this union. How can I justify putting my personal happiness above the welfare of so many others?" "Because a marriage built on duty alone will ultimately serve no one well," Damien replied with conviction. "Prince Aldric deserves a wife who loves him wholeheartedly, not one who merely tolerates his presence while dreaming of another. Your family deserves to see you happy, not trapped in a gilded cage of obligation and regret." His words made sense intellectually, but emotionally Mirelle remained torn between conflicting loyalties and desires. "Show me again," she whispered, moving closer until she could feel the coolness of his supernatural presence. "Show me what love should feel like, so I can be certain that what I feel for you is real and not merely a fantasy born of anxiety and uncertainty." Damien drew her into his arms, and once again she experienced the extraordinary sensation of spiritual union that transcended physical limitations. In his embrace, she felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with recognition. It was as if she had been searching her entire life for this connection, this sense of finding the other half of her soul. When he kissed her, the rest of the world faded away, leaving only the perfect harmony of two spirits that had been created to complement each other. "This is real," she said when they finally separated, her voice filled with wonder and certainty. "What we have together is more real than anything I have ever experienced." "Yes," Damien agreed, his eyes shining with love and infinite sadness. "And that is why you must be absolutely certain before you choose me over the life you could have with Prince Aldric. Because once you make that choice, there will be no going back. You will be mine in every way that matters, bound to me by forces that transcend death itself." "What exactly are you asking of me?" Mirelle said, though part of her already understood the implications. Are you saying that choosing you would mean giving up my mortal life? I don't know, Damien admitted with devastating honesty. The rules governing my existence are not clearly defined. It's possible that declaring your love for me would free me to move on to whatever comes next, allowing us both to find peace. It's equally possible that it would bind you to this half-existence between life and death, trapping you here as I have been trapped. The magnitude of what he was suggesting should have terrified her. But instead, Mirelle felt a strange sense of relief. At least now she understood the true nature of the choice she faced. It was not simply a matter of choosing between two men, but between two entirely different forms of existence. She could marry Prince Aldric and live a conventional life as a royal wife and mother, contributing to the stability and prosperity of the kingdom, while always carrying the memory of a love that could never be fully realized. Or she could choose Damien and step into the unknown, accepting whatever consequences arose from loving someone who existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. I need to spend time with Prince Aldric, she said finally. I need to give him every possible chance to win my heart, both for his sake and for mine. If there is any possibility that I could learn to love him as he deserves, then I owe it to everyone involved to explore that possibility thoroughly. I understand, Damien said, though she could see the pain her words caused him. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will accept your choice without bitterness or resentment. My love for you is not possessive or demanding. I want only your happiness, even if that happiness must be found with someone else. They spent the remainder of the night in quiet conversation, sharing memories and dreams while carefully avoiding any discussion of the future. When dawn approached and Damien began to fade back into the spirit realm, Mirelle felt as if a part of herself was being torn away. The connection between them had grown so strong that his absence left her feeling incomplete, as if she were missing some essential element of her own identity. The next morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the riding excursion Prince Aldric had proposed. Mirelle dressed in a riding habit of deep green wool that complemented her coloring, and she arranged her hair in a practical style that would remain neat despite the morning's activities. As she prepared to meet her intended husband, she tried to approach the encounter with an open mind and a sincere desire to discover whatever positive qualities he might possess. Prince Aldric was waiting for her in the courtyard with two magnificent horses already saddled and ready for their journey. He had chosen a spirited black stallion for himself and a gentle mare with intelligent eyes for her, demonstrating his consideration for her comfort and safety. His own riding attire emphasized his tall, athletic build, and he looked every inch the romantic hero as he helped her mount and adjusted her stirrups with practiced efficiency. I felt we might ride to the old monastery ruins, he said as they set off through the palace gates. The views from there are spectacular, and it's far enough from the palace to ensure we won't be interrupted by well-meaning servants or family members. The morning ride proved pleasant despite Mirelle's inner turmoil. Prince Aldric was an excellent horseman and a considerate companion, adjusting their pace to match her abilities and pointing out various landmarks and features of the countryside. He spoke knowledgeably about the history of the region, the agricultural practices of the local farmers, and his plans for improving the economic prosperity of the kingdom. His intelligence and genuine concern for his future subjects were evident in every word, and Mirelle found herself developing a grudging respect for his character, even as her heart remained unmoved by his presence. The monastery ruins occupied a hilltop overlooking the valley, their Gothic arches and crumbling walls creating a romantic backdrop that might have been designed specifically for intimate conversations. Prince Aldric helped Mirelle dismount and led her to a stone bench where they could sit comfortably while enjoying the panoramic view. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching the morning mist rise from the fields below and listening to the songs of birds hidden in the nearby trees. I confess I have been somewhat nervous about this conversation, Prince Aldric said finally, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that she had not heard before. Political marriages are common in our circles, but that doesn't make them any less daunting for the individuals involved. I have been nervous as well, Mirelle admitted, grateful for his honesty. It's difficult to know how to begin building a relationship when so much depends on its success. Perhaps we might start by being completely honest with each other about our expectations and concerns, he suggested, turning to face her more directly. I have no desire to force you into a marriage that would make you miserable, nor do I wish to enter into such an important commitment without understanding your true feelings. His words offered the perfect opening for the conversation Mirelle knew they needed to have, yet she found herself struggling to find the right way to express her complicated emotional state. How could she explain her feelings for Damien without sounding delusional or unfaithful? How could she make him understand that her lack of enthusiasm for their marriage had nothing to do with his personal qualities and everything to do with circumstances beyond anyone's control? Your Highness, she began carefully, I want you to know that I have the deepest respect for your character and appreciation for the honor you do me in offering marriage. You are everything any reasonable woman should want in a husband. I sense there is a but coming, Prince Aldric observed with a rueful smile. Please, speak freely. I would rather hear painful truths than comfortable lies. The difficulty is not with you personally, but with my own heart, Mirelle said, choosing her words with great care. I find myself attached to someone else, someone I can never marry but whom I cannot forget. I fear that such feelings would make me a poor wife to you, regardless of my intentions to be dutiful and faithful. Prince Aldric was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her face with thoughtful consideration. May I ask who this other person is? Someone from your father's court, perhaps? Or a neighbor you knew before coming here? Someone I met here at the palace, she said, which was technically true even if it failed to capture the supernatural nature of her relationship with Damien. Someone with whom I have discovered a connection that I cannot rationalize or dismiss, despite its impossibility. Ah, Prince Aldric said, and his expression grew more serious. That does complicate matters considerably. Is this person someone who could offer you marriage if our engagement were dissolved? The question cut straight to the heart of her dilemma, and Mirelle felt tears prick at her eyes as she contemplated the honest answer. No, she whispered. There are circumstances that make marriage impossible, circumstances that cannot be changed or overcome. Then you are choosing to refuse a possible future with me in favor of a hopeless attachment to someone else? There was no accusation in his voice, only genuine puzzlement and perhaps a touch of concern for her well-being. I am not choosing anything yet, Mirelle said quickly. I am simply being honest about the state of my heart, so that you can make an informed decision about whether you wish to proceed with our engagement, if you feel that my divided loyalties would make me unsuitable as a pre-teen wife. I will understand completely, and will find some way to explain the situation to our families that preserves your honor and dignity. Prince Aldric rose from the bench and walked to the edge of the ruins, where he stood with his back to her, apparently lost in thought. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken implications and the knowledge that whatever he decided would determine the course of both their lives. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression was resolved but not unkind. Lady Mirelle, he said formally, I appreciate your honesty more than you can know. Lesser women might have chosen to conceal their true feelings until after the wedding, leaving both parties trapped in an unhappy union. He paused, choosing his words carefully. However, I find myself in the unusual position of being able to offer you an alternative. What kind of alternative? She asked, hardly daring to hope that he might release her from their engagement without diplomatic consequences. The truth is that I, too, have found my affections engaged elsewhere during my recent travels, he admitted with obvious reluctance. Lady Catherine Montrose, daughter of the Duke of Westmark, accompanied our diplomatic party as part of her father's delegation. We discovered a remarkable compatibility of temperament and interests, and I confess that I have come to care for her deeply. Mirelle stared at him in amazement, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. You mean that you are as reluctant to marry me as I am to marry you? Precisely, Prince Aldric said with a smile that transformed his features and made him appear more human and approachable than she had yet seen him. Which suggests that we might be able to find a solution that serves both our interests without causing undue scandal or diplomatic complications. What are you proposing? That we maintain the pretense of considering our engagement for several more weeks, giving both of us time to explore our other attachments and determine whether they have the potential for lasting happiness, he explained. If we both conclude that our hearts lie elsewhere, we can jointly request that our families dissolve the engagement on the grounds of mutual incompatibility, discovered through proper courtship. The proposal was so unexpected and reasonable that Mirelle felt a wave of relief wash over her. You would be willing to do that? To risk the political and economic benefits of our alliance for the sake of personal happiness? I believe that marriages built on genuine affection serve the kingdom better than those based solely on political necessity, Prince Aldric said with conviction. My parents' marriage was arranged, but they grew to love each other deeply over the years. However, I have observed other political unions that remained cold and formal throughout their duration, producing neither personal happiness nor effective governance. What of Lady Catherine? Does she return your feelings? I believe so, though we have not yet spoken as frankly as you and I have today, he admitted. Her father would need to be convinced that an alliance with our kingdom would benefit his territory, but such negotiations are not impossible if both parties are committed to finding a solution. What? For the first time since arriving at the palace, Mirelle felt as if the weight of impossible choices was beginning to lift from her shoulders. Your Highness, I cannot express how grateful I am for your understanding and generosity. To be given time to explore my own situation without the pressure of immediate decision-making is more than I dared hope for. Then we are agreed, Prince Aldric said, extending his hand in a gesture of partnership rather than romance. We will play the part of a courting couple for the benefit of our families in the court, while privately pursuing our actual inclinations. At the end of 1 month, we will meet again and decide how to proceed based on what we have learned about our respective situations. They shook hands solemnly, sealing their unusual bargain, and Mirelle felt lighter than she had in weeks. The ride back to the palace was filled with easy conversation and shared laughter as they discussed the practical aspects of their deception and discovered that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company once the pressure of romantic expectations had been removed. Prince Aldric proved to have a sharp wit and a refreshing sense of humor, and she began to understand why Lady Catherine had been drawn to him despite the complications of their different stations. That evening, the royal family gathered for dinner in the smaller dining room, and the atmosphere was noticeably more relaxed than it had been during the formal welcome festivities. Prince Aldric played his part perfectly, paying Mirelle courteous attention without excessive romanticism, and engaging his mother and Lady Ashford in discussions about wedding plans with just the right mixture of enthusiasm and practical consideration. I think a winter wedding would be lovely, Queen Isabel said, her eyes bright with maternal satisfaction. Perhaps in early December, when the palace can be decorated with evergreens, and the ceremony will have a magical, seasonal atmosphere. That would give us adequate time for preparations, Lady Ashford agreed, making notes in the leather-bound journal she always carried. The guest list alone will require weeks of consideration, as we must balance political necessity with practical limitations of space and accommodation. What are your thoughts, my dear? The Queen asked, turning to Mirelle. With an expectant smile. Do you have preferences regarding the timing or style of the ceremony? I defer to your greater experience in such matters. Mirelle replied diplomatically, grateful that Prince Aldric had given her the luxury of participating in these discussions without the weight of immediate commitment. I am certain that whatever arrangements you make will be both beautiful and appropriate. Spoken like a true diplomat, Prince Aldric said with an approving smile that was only partially feigned. I can see that you will be an asset to the kingdom in more ways than one. After dinner, Mirelle excused herself earlier than usual, claiming fatigue from the morning's ride and the emotional intensity of meeting her intended husband. In truth, she was eager to return to her chambers and process everything that had occurred, particularly the unexpected reprieve that Prince Aldric's confession had provided. As she prepared for bed, she found herself anticipating her next encounter with Damien, with more excitement than she had felt in days. When the harpsichord music began at midnight, she was ready and waiting, dressed in a gown of silver silk that caught the candlelight and made her appear almost ethereal herself. Prince Damien materialized with his usual grace, but tonight his expression was questioning rather than melancholy, as if he sensed that something fundamental had changed in her situation. "You look different tonight," he observed, moving closer to study her face in the flickering light. "There's a lightness about you that wasn't there this morning. Your conversation with Prince Aldric went well, I take it?" "Better than I dared hope," Mirelle said, unable to suppress a smile of relief and joy. "It seems that his heart is as engaged elsewhere as mine is, and he has proposed that we maintain the pretense of courtship while privately exploring our actual inclinations." Damien's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. "He knows about your feelings for someone else?" "I told him that I had formed an attachment to someone I could never marry," she explained. "I could hardly explain the supernatural nature of our relationship, but he understood enough to recognize that I would not make him a happy wife while my heart belonged elsewhere. And he was not angry or insulted." "By your honesty?" "Quite the opposite. He confessed that he has fallen in love with a young lady he met during his diplomatic mission, someone he would prefer to marry if political considerations could be arranged to permit it." Mirelle moved closer, drawn as always by the magnetic pull of his presence. "We have agreed to give ourselves a month to determine whether our respective attachments have the potential for lasting happiness." The relief and joy that transformed Damien's features made him appear almost luminous with happiness. "A month," he repeated, as if the word were a precious gift. "A month to explore what we could have together without the immediate pressure of choosing between love and duty. A month to determine whether what we feel for each other is strong enough to justify the risks and sacrifices it would require," she corrected gently. "Because I need to understand exactly what choosing you would mean, not just for me but for everyone whose lives would be affected by my decision." "Then let me show you," Damien said, taking her hands in his cool, insubstantial grasp. "Let me show you what existence could be like if you chose to join me in this realm between life and death. But I warn you, my darling, that once you have experienced the full scope of what I can offer, the choice you face will become even more difficult." "I'm not afraid," Mirelle said, though part of her wondered if she should be. "Show me everything. I want to understand completely what I would be gaining and what I would be losing." What followed was the most extraordinary experience of Mirelle's life. Damien drew her into his arms, and suddenly they were no longer bound by the physical limitations of her chambers, or even the palace itself. They soared through the night sky like beings of pure spirit, traveling to places that existed only in the realm of the supernatural. He showed her cities of light where spirits who had found peace gathered to share music and poetry and philosophical discourse. He took her to vast libraries that contained not just every book that had ever been written, but every story that had ever been imagined or dreamed. In one magnificent garden, they walked among flowers that sang with voices like silver bells, each bloom containing the essence of a love story that had transcended death itself. Damien explained that this was where couples who had chosen love over life came to spend eternity together. Their devotion so pure and strong that it had earned them a place in paradise, rather than the liminal existence that trapped less committed souls. "This could be ours," he said as they stood before a fountain where the water sparkled with liquid starlight. "If your love for me proves strong enough to sustain the transition from mortal to spiritual existence, we could spend eternity in places like this, exploring wonders that mortal minds cannot even conceive. And if my love is not strong enough?" Mirelle asked, though she was already certain that her feelings for him transcended any earthly attachment she had ever experienced. "Then you would be trapped as I have been trapped, existing in the shadows between worlds, unable to find peace but unable to truly live," he admitted with devastating honesty. "The risk is real, my darling. I cannot promise you that choosing me will lead to happiness. I can only promise that whatever happens, we will face it together." They spent hours exploring the supernatural realm, visiting places of incredible beauty, and meeting spirits who had made the same choice that now faced Mirelle. Some had found blissful eternal union with their beloved. Others remained trapped in the palace or similar earthly locations, forever seeking a peace that eluded them. The common factor among all of them was the intensity of their love, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of connection that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience. As dawn approached and they returned to her chambers, Mirelle felt more certain than ever that her feelings for Damien were real and lasting. Yet she also understood more clearly the magnitude of what she would be risking if she chose to join him in the spirit realm. It was not simply a matter of giving up her mortal life, but of gambling her very soul on the strength of their connection. "I need to use this month wisely," she said as Damien began to fade with the approaching sunrise. "I need to be absolutely certain that what I feel for you is strong enough to sustain such a dramatic transformation. And I need to find a way to determine whether my love for you is the mature, selfless emotion I believe it to be, or merely another manifestation of the possessive desire that trapped me here in the first place," he replied, his voice growing faint as his form became translucent. "If I am to ask you to risk everything for me, I must be certain that I am worthy of such a sacrifice." Over the following weeks, Mirelle and Prince Aldric maintained their charade of courtship with increasing skill and comfort. They rode together each morning, exploring different areas of the estate and engaging in conversations that revealed their genuine compatibility as friends, even as it confirmed their lack of romantic chemistry. They attended court functions as a couple, danced together at formal entertainments, and participated in the elaborate social rituals that surrounded their supposed engagement. But deception was made easier by the fact that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company once the pressure of forced romance had been removed. Prince Aldric proved to be intelligent, well-read, and possessed of a dry humor that complemented Mirelle's own tendency toward witty observations. They discovered shared interests in literature and music, and their conversations often extended far beyond the time required for their public performances. "You would make an excellent friend if circumstances were different," Prince Aldric observed one morning as they paused to rest their horses beside a stream that wound through the estate grounds. "I confess I had not expected to find someone so easy to talk to, given the artificial nature of our arrangement." "The feeling is mutual," Mirelle replied with a smile. "I hope that when this month ends and we go our separate ways, we will be able to maintain some form of friendship despite the awkwardness of our current situation." "I would like that very much," he said, his expression growing more serious. "In fact, I hope you will consider me someone you can turn to for assistance if your own romantic situation becomes complicated. I may not be able to offer marriage, but I can certainly provide protection and support if needed." His offer touched her more deeply than he probably realized, and she felt a pang of guilt about the deception she was practicing. If only he knew that her impossible attachment was to a man who had been dead for 2 centuries, he might be less generous with his offers of assistance. Yet she was grateful for his friendship and his understanding, and she promised herself that she would find a way to help him achieve his own romantic goals, regardless of how her situation with Damien resolved itself. Meanwhile, her nocturnal encounters with Prince Damien continued to deepen and intensify. Each night brought new revelations about the nature of spiritual existence and the bonds that could unite souls across the barrier of death. They explored philosophy and poetry together, sharing their deepest thoughts about love, mortality, and the meaning of existence. Damien introduced her to other spirits who had once faced similar choices, allowing her to hear their stories and learn from their experiences. Perhaps most importantly, she began to understand the true nature of Damien's own transformation over the centuries. The selfish, possessive young man who had died for love had evolved into someone capable of genuine selflessness and mature devotion. His love for her was not the desperate passion that had driven him to challenge Duke Roderick to a duel, but the steady, enduring affection of a soul that had learned the true meaning of love through centuries of solitude, reflection. "I want you to be happy," he told her one night as they walked through a moonlit garden that existed somewhere between the physical and spiritual realms. "If that happiness can be found with Prince Aldric or some other mortal man, then I will find a way to be content with having known you, even briefly." "And if my happiness can only be found with you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. "Then I will do everything in my power to ensure that choosing me brings you joy rather than regret," he promised, drawing her close in an embrace that felt more solid and substantial than ever before. "Our love has already begun to change me, to make me more present in the physical world. Perhaps it will prove strong enough to transform the very nature of my existence." As the month progressed, Mirelle found herself growing more confident in her feelings and more certain of her ultimate choice. The contrast between her easy friendship with Prince Aldric and her passionate connection with Damien only served to emphasize how completely her heart belonged to the ghostly prince. Yet she was careful not to make any final decisions until the agreed-upon deadline, wanting to honor her commitment to Prince Aldric and ensure that she considered every possible alternative. The answer came to her during the final week of their arrangement, as she sat in the palace library reading the same historical chronicle that had first told her Damien's story. As she reread the account of his tragic love affair with Lady Celeste, she suddenly understood something that had escaped her notice before. The chronicler had noted that strange supernatural occurrences had begun immediately after their deaths, but had failed to mention one crucial detail. Lady Celeste's spirit had never been seen or heard from again after the night she threw herself from the battlements. The implication was startling and hopeful in equal measure. If Lady Celeste had never been trapped in the liminal existence that held Damien, it suggested that her love had been strong enough to carry her directly to whatever realm awaited them beyond death. Only Damien had remained behind, anchored by some aspect of his character or circumstances that prevented him from following her into the unknown. That night, she shared her discovery with Damien, and watched as hope and wonder transformed his features. "You think that her love was pure enough to transcend death completely," he said, his voice filled with amazement, "while mine was selfish enough to trap me here until I could learn the true meaning of selfless devotion." "I think you have learned that lesson," Mirelle said with certainty. "The man I have come to know over these past weeks bears no resemblance to the possessive young prince who fought a duel over a woman who belonged to another. You have become someone capable of true love, the kind that desires only the beloved's happiness. Then perhaps," Damien said softly, "our love might be strong enough to break the chains that have bound me here and carry us both to whatever lies beyond the veil of death." The possibility filled Mirelle with both excitement and terror. She had grown comfortable with the idea of choosing love over duty, but the prospect of dying for that love was something else entirely. Yet as she looked into Damien's eyes and felt the profound connection that existed between them, she realized that death held no fear for her if it meant eternal union with the man who had become the other half of her soul. "When?" she asked simply. "Tomorrow night," he replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "Prince Aldric's month of grace ends in 3 days, and you will need to give him your answer. If we are going to attempt this transformation, it should be before you are forced to choose between an earthly marriage and a lifetime of, quote, regret." The next day passed in a haze of preparation and reflection. Mirelle went through the motions of her daily routine, but her thoughts remained focused on the momentous decision she had made. She spent time writing letters to her family, explaining her choice in terms they might eventually come to understand and forgive. She could not tell them the truth about Damien's supernatural nature, but she could express her certainty that she had found a love worth any sacrifice. She also sought out Prince Aldric for one final conversation, wanting to ensure that her choice would not leave him in an impossible diplomatic position. They met in the rose garden where they had shared so many pleasant morning walks, and she was touched by his obvious concern for her well-being. "You look different today," he observed, studying her face with the acute perception she had come to appreciate in him. "More resolved, but also sad. Have you reached a decision about your mysterious attachment?" "I have," she said simply. "And I wanted to thank you for giving me the time and space to explore my feelings without pressure or judgment. Your friendship has meant more to me than you can know." "That sounds distinctly like a farewell," Prince Aldric said, his expression growing troubled. "Mirelle, whatever you are contemplating, please consider carefully whether the price you are paying is worth the prize you hope to gain." If only he knew how prescient his words were. "I have considered everything," she assured him. "And I have chosen love over security, passion over duty, the unknown over the predictable. I hope you will do the same with Lady Catherine." "I intend to," he said, taking her hands in a gesture of friendship and support. "But I also intend to survive my choice and build a life worth living. Promise me that you will do the same." She could not make such a promise in good conscience, but she smiled and squeezed his hands affectionately. "Promise me that you will be happy," she said instead, "and that you will remember me fondly, whatever the future may bring. That evening, Mirelle prepared for her final encounter with Damien, with the solemnity of a bride preparing for her wedding. She chose a gown of pure white silk that seemed to glow in the candlelight, and she left her hair loose around her shoulders like a maiden's. The irony was not lost on her that she was preparing to become a bride of sorts, though her groom was already dead and their ceremony would take place in realms beyond mortal comprehension. When Damien appeared at midnight, he too was dressed with unusual formality, wearing the court attire of his own era, but somehow transformed into something that seemed to belong to no earthly time or place. His dark hair was perfectly arranged, and his gray eyes held a mixture of love and solemnity that took her breath away. He looked like a prince from a fairy tale, beautiful and otherworldly and completely devoted to the woman he loved. "Are you certain?" he asked, though his voice held no doubt about her answer. "Once we begin this process, there will be no turning back. You will leave behind everything and everyone you have ever known for the sake of a love that exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience." "I am certain," Mirelle replied without hesitation. "I would rather have eternity with you than a lifetime without you." Damien smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, the sadness completely left his eyes. "Then let us begin," he said, extending his hand to her with courtly grace. "Let us discover together whether love truly can conquer death." What followed was unlike anything Mirelle could have imagined, even after all her supernatural experiences. Damien drew her into his arms, and suddenly they were rising, not through the physical space of her chambers but through layers of reality itself. She felt her connection to her mortal body growing thinner and more tenuous as they ascended. Yet instead of fear, she experienced only a profound sense of liberation and joy. Around them, the palace faded away to be replaced by visions of incredible beauty and wonder. They passed through realms of pure light, where music played constantly without instruments, where colors existed that had no names in mortal languages, where the very air sparkled with the essence of love itself. Other spirits watched their passage with expressions of joy and encouragement, as if their love story had been anticipated and celebrated throughout the supernatural realm. Finally, they came to rest in a garden that surpassed even Damien's previous supernatural manifestations in its ethereal beauty. Here, flowers bloomed in impossible profusion, their petals seeming to be made of condensed starlight, and their fragrance carrying the essence of every beautiful moment that had ever existed. A fountain at the center of the garden sang with voices like crystal bells, and the water that flowed from it seemed to contain liquid moonbeams. "This is where we will spend eternity," Damien said, his voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "This is the realm reserved for those whose love proves strong enough to transcend the boundaries between life and death." Mirelle looked around at the impossible beauty surrounding them, and felt her heart overflow with happiness. Yet even as she marveled at their supernatural paradise, she noticed something that filled her with even greater joy. Damien's form had become completely solid and substantial, no longer the translucent specter she had known, but a man as real and present as any living being. "You're really here," she breathed, reaching out to touch his face with hands that could actually feel the warmth of his skin. "You're completely real." "As are you," he replied, kissing her with lips that were now capable of true physical contact. "Our love has transformed us both, freed us from the limitations that kept us apart. We are no longer bound by the constraints of mortality or the half-existence of spirits who cannot find peace." They explored their new realm together, discovering wonders that exceeded even the most elaborate fairy tales. There were libraries containing not just every book that had ever been written, but every story that could ever be imagined. There were theaters where the greatest dramas of love and sacrifice played out for audiences of spirits who had chosen passion over safety. There were gardens where they could walk for eternity without ever seeing the same flower twice. Yet perhaps most wonderful of all was the simple pleasure of being together without reservation or limitation. They could touch each other, hold each other, express their love in all the ways that had been denied to them in the mortal realm. Their connection had transcended not just death, but every barrier that could possibly exist between two souls meant to be united. "Do you regret it?" Damien asked as they stood together watching a sunset that painted the sky in colors that existed nowhere in the mortal world. "Do you regret leaving behind the life you could have had?" Mirelle considered the question seriously, thinking of her family and friends, of Prince Aldric and the diplomatic alliance that would now never take place, of all the experiences she would never have as a mortal woman. Yet when she weighed those losses against the perfect happiness she had found in Damien's arms, there was no contest. "I regret nothing," she said with absolute certainty. "This is where I belong, where I was always meant to be. Everything that came before was simply preparation for finding you. And I regret only the centuries I spent in darkness before you arrived to show me the light," he replied, drawing her close in an embrace that felt like coming home. "Lady Celeste was my first love, the passion of my youth that taught me the intensity of connection. But you are my true love, the completion of my soul that I spent 200 years seeking." Back in the mortal realm, the palace mourned the mysterious disappearance of Lady Mirelle, who had vanished from her locked chambers without a trace. Prince Aldric provided support and comfort to the grieving royal household, while privately understanding that his friend had found the courage to choose love over duty in the most dramatic way possible. He honored her memory by pursuing his own happiness with Lady Catherine, and their marriage became one of the great love stories of their generation. The servants still whispered of supernatural occurrences in the East Wing, but the nature of these manifestations had changed completely. Instead of melancholy harpsichord music and the lonely figure of a tragic prince, visitors reported hearing joyful laughter and glimpsing couples dancing in moonlit ballrooms that should have been empty. The presence that had haunted the palace for 2 centuries had found peace at last, and with it, the ability to inspire hope rather than sorrow in those who encountered echoes of their eternal love story. Lady Ashford, ever practical, had the East Wing renovated and redecorated, claiming that a change of atmosphere might dispel the supernatural reputation that had troubled the palace for so long. Yet she could not entirely eliminate the stories, for love as pure and powerful as Mirelle and Damien's leaves traces that transcend the physical world. Even now, young women who visit the palace sometimes report dreams of dancing with handsome princes, and poets find inspiration in the halls where a shy noble girl chose love over duty and discovered that some connections are indeed stronger than death itself. In the supernatural realm where they now reside, Mirelle and Damien continue their eternal romance, exploring the infinite wonders available to souls who have transcended mortal limitations. Their love story has become legend among the spirits, proof that true devotion can overcome any obstacle, and that those brave enough to risk everything for love will find rewards beyond imagination. They have become guardians of sorts for other lovers facing impossible choices, appearing in dreams and visions to offer encouragement and hope. Their message is always the same: that love without courage is merely sentiment, but love with the strength to sacrifice everything becomes a force that can reshape reality itself. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the palace is quiet, visitors still hear the faint strains of harpsichord music drifting through the corridors. But now it is not a lonely lament for lost love, but a celebration of love triumphant, a reminder that some connections are indeed eternal, and that those who choose passion over safety may find themselves rewarded with forever. The portrait of Prince Damien still hangs in the gallery, but the expression of profound sadness has been replaced by one of peaceful contentment. Beside it now hangs a painting of Lady Mirelle that appeared mysteriously one morning, showing her as she looked on the night she chose eternity over mortality. Together, their painted eyes watch over the palace, guardians of a love story that proves that even death cannot separate souls that are truly meant to be together. And in the gardens where they once walked as forbidden lovers, night-blooming jasmine grows wild and free, filling the air with a fragrance so sweet and intoxicating that it moves even the most practical visitors to thoughts of romance and the possibility that somewhere, in realms beyond mortal understanding, love really can conquer all.